my name is Jess and welcome to my channel, Jess in Romancelandia, where I talk about romance books and happily ever afters and how they are one day going to topple the patriarchy. Today I'm filming one of the videos that I have been the most excited to film over the course of this channel, and that is my top 10 books of 2020. 2020 has been a year. And I'm very relieved that it's coming to an end. For all of you out there, I hope that you're safe and happy and that 2021 is far better for the world, really. For me, reading has been a massive comfort this year. When the world is literally on fire outside of your window, there's something very reassuring about going into a book where happily ever after is literally built in. And so because of that, I managed to read 234 books this year, which I think might be the most I've read in a year ever. So I'm ridiculously chuffed with that, and honestly very thankful for all of the words that have helped me through this year. Not every book I read this year was romance. I read several others in my spare time and for uni, but this is a top 10 romance list because I feel like with the theme of my channel it would be very weird if I spoke about like 9 historical romances and then tossed in like All Quiet on the Western Front just for fun at the end. Like those are very tonally different books, so we're sticking with the romance, which to be honest are where most of my favourite reads of this year fall. When I say top 10 reads of 2020, I also want to note that these are not necessarily books that came out in 2020. In fact, I think the majority of them did not and came out before that. They were just all books that I encountered for the first time this year. So like I said, this is a top 10 list, but because of the immense amount of books and novellas that I read this year, it was really hard to narrow it down to just 10. So I've kind of cheated a little bit, so I've got 10 core favourites and then 3 honourable mentions, which just missed making it on that short list, but that I really enjoyed and feel need a mention anyway. So I'm going to start with those before getting into the list. So the first honourable mention that I have to talk about is The Secret Diary of Miss Miranda Cheever by Julia Quinn. One piece of good news is that Julia Quinn has had a really great year career-wise. So Bridgerton is coming to Netflix. Bridgerton is probably her most famous series. She's also had a fair few other releases this year with books like First Comes Scandal, which attracted loads of attention from magazines like Entertainment Weekly, and I think Oprah did like a cover on it as well, but don't quote me on that. But for me, a Julia Quinn era and book that I think is severely underrated is this one. I adore this book. I think a big reason I love it is because it feels like a plot that you would see in a modern rom-com, but kind of transposed onto that fun Regency era. It follows a young woman called Miranda Cheever who, for as long as she can remember, has had a massive crush on her friend's older brother. One year, when Miranda is feeling very down after a particularly harsh falling out with a peer of hers at a party, this older brother suggests that Miranda start keeping a diary to release all of her feelings into, which she begins to do. Years later, when Miranda is still keeping this diary, her best friend's older brother comes back into town and starts to see Miranda, who has kind of flourished into a young woman, in a very different light. I really enjoy the brother's best friend trope, the older brother's best friend figure. I think because there's just so much innate angst and conflict kind of built into the trope itself. It's also one of Julia Quinn's sexier books, I think, which is really cool as well because it brings in lots of discussions about women and sexism at the time. Miranda thinks a lot about how she is judged far more harshly for her engagements with sexuality than her love interest is, and that is one of my favourite scenes in the book. I think it's something that is referenced a lot in romance, but should definitely be spoken about more. It's just a wonderful romantic book, and if you haven't read this one by Julia Quinn, highly recommend. The next honourable mention is one I discovered fairly recently, and that is In This Iron Ground by Marina Vivancos. I tore through Marina Vivancos's entire bibliography towards the end of this year and have zero regrets about it. I don't want to say too much about the plot itself of In This Iron Ground. I will tell you it is an LGBTQ+ urban fantasy romance which has werewolves and magic and people that can channel magic. But for me, the real draw of the books isn't this really lovely take on the urban fantasy genre. It's the level of emotion that Marina Vivancos brings to it and brings to all of her books. I read online that Marina Vivancos used to work in the mental health industry, and honestly I'm not surprised. All of her books have a real focus on healing and self-reflection and therapy, and so it makes her books really unbelievably cathartic to read because you're not just reading this like wonderful love story between two people, you're reading about all of her individual characters really learning to love themselves and come to terms with themselves, which sounds incredibly cheesy, but you know, We all need a bit of that cheese in 2020. We need some self-love at the end of this year. So yes, I highly recommend this, and honestly all of her books. I've really enjoyed every one that I've read, and they are all in Kindle Unlimited. So if you have that, definitely worth picking them up. And the final book I've got to mention is by another favourite author discovery of mine this year, and that is After Felix by Lily Morton. This is the final book in her Close Proximity series. You don't have to have read the first 2 books to read this one, but I do think you'll appreciate it more if you do, because the main characters in this one do crop up in earlier instalments, and there are little hints about their story in there. Again, I don't want to say too much about the plot of this one because it's really hard to talk about without giving away spoilers, but I will tell you that it's a second chance romance between Felix and Max that's set mainly in London, but also has little stop-offs in like Naples and various other cities. Lily Morton is really great at setting in her books, and definitely in this one the main character lives in a houseboat and it's just so aesthetically pleasing. I was kind of surprised at just how much I adored this one. I love all of Lily Morton's books because they're all really infused with a very British sense of humour that's just super homely and reassuring to me. But this one packed an extra emotional punch that I didn't see coming but absolutely loved. So yeah, After Felix, my final honourable mention, definitely worth picking up if you haven't already. Okay, so now those 3 cheap mentions are out of the way, I'm going to get into the main list. These are in no particular order because it would have been impossible to order them, but broadly speaking, they are my 10 collective favourites of the year. So the first book I'm going to mention is Married by Morning by Lisa Kleypas. This is the 4th book in her Hathaway series, which revolves around a very scatty, quirky Regency family called the Hathaways. Married by Morning revolves around the only man in the Hathaway clan, Leo, and his younger sister's prickly governess, Catherine Marks. When we first meet Leo in the Hathaway series, he is struggling in a lot of ways. He is struggling with alcohol addiction, with personal loss and heartbreak, which he's really channeling through gambling away money, sleeping with a lot of women, smoking a lot of opium. However, by the start of Married by Morning, Leo has largely got his life back on track. He is focusing on the well-being of his family, he is restoring their family home, but one remaining thorn in his side is Catherine, who is kind of unwilling to let Leo get away with any of his old shit and is regularly calling him out on his behaviour, his rakishness, his kind of irreverence in the world. Leo and Catherine are probably my favourite Lisa Kleypas couple. They are polar opposites in so many ways. You've got the rakish, charming, irreverent Leo on one hand and the uptight, book-smart Cat on the other. But when they come together, there's just something that works so well about them. Their dialogue, their rapport, it's pitch perfect. I absolutely adore the entire Hathaway series, but because of this wonderful romance, this one really stood out to me and definitely deserved a place on the list of this year. The next book on my list is Red, White and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. I have spoken about this book so much on this channel, but I absolutely adored it, as I know so many of you did. This book follows the fictional first son of the United States, Alex, as he is forced to strike up a media friendship with the Prince of England after a little tiff at the royal wedding goes wrong. However, eventually this media orchestrated friendship turns into a real life relationship as Alex and the Prince of England, Henry, start to develop feelings for one another. I honestly believe that Casey McQuiston is one of the writers that is going to bring the romantic comedy roaring into the 2020s. Everything about this book is just so pitch perfect. The pop culture references, the snarky, almost Tumblr-esque humour, the really snappy dialogue, it all reads like a movie script. As wonderful as all of that stuff is, however, what I maybe love the most about this romance is how unabashedly optimistic it is. It envisions a world in which tolerance and acceptance and love are the forces that win. And I think that's something that after this year, and after honestly the politics and the world drama of the past 5 years, we really needed to see. The next book I have to recommend was a surprise favourite of this year. I wasn't expecting to adore it as much as I did, and that is Mrs. Martin's Incomparable Adventure by Courtney Milan. You guys will know, if you've watched some of my other videos on this channel, that Courtney Milan is one of my all-time favourite authors, especially when it comes to her historical romances, and Mrs. Martin's Incomparable Adventure is definitely one of her best. It follows a woman who is either in her 70s or her 80s, I believe, called Violetta, who is having some issues when one particularly unruly tenant isn't paying up for the time he's spent at a lodgings house that she works at. Desperate for money to earn her own livelihood, she turns to this man's aunt, Beatrice Martin, who is a wealthy aristocratic widow, to try and convince her to basically pay up on her nephew's behalf. However, after Beatrice hears about her nephew's behaviour, she decides that rather than simply paying up, it's time to teach her horrible nephew a lesson about swindling his relatives and working women out of money by getting their revenge in alternate ways. So she and Violetta team up to take the man down. This book was just a breath of fresh air when it came to the romance genre. It's so rare that we read books with women over 40 as the main heroines, let alone two women in their 80s, let alone then two women that don't go off and find male love interests but fall in love with each other instead. It just felt like a beautiful middle finger to all of the homophobia, ageism and sexism that exists in the world, and Courtney Milan delivered that middle finger with her classic wit and emotion. Beatrice Martin is an icon in every sense of the word, and the stuff that she came out with, both to Violetta and her terrible nephew, had me in stitches so many times throughout it. It is just one of the most wonderful, heartwarming yet moving historical romances I've read in a really long time, so I highly recommend this one if you haven't picked it up yet. The next book on my list is A Wicked Kind of Husband by Mia Vinci. This book follows a woman named Cassandra who, some years prior, when her father was on his deathbed, agreed to marry a man that she didn't really know before, only to be shunted off into a country home the second the wedding was over. However, after some years in the country, Cassandra decides that her younger siblings need to experience city life and start building lives of their own, so she goes to track down her husband and convince him to help her launch her sisters in the London season. This book had such an interesting premise because even though the main couple, Cassandra and Joshua, have been married for a few years at the start of the novel, they don't know each other at all because they've spent almost their entire marriage, apart from the marriage ceremony itself, apart. So this book is really about a husband and a wife learning to fall in love with each other after the marriage has already happened, which is a very interesting dynamic, and it's one that Mia Vinci negotiates incredibly well. Cassandra is wonderful because she puts on a very strong front and she does not let her husband push her around, but at the same time she's not that cliche of the strong female character that's never allowed to feel human emotion. The reader is made very aware throughout that Cassandra is hurting and that she is trying to process that hurt in the healthiest way that she can, and that is just a take on the kind of strong romance heroine that I really enjoyed. I think we need to see more examples in books of women that are strong without needing that strength to be justified by there being no other emotions at all. It happens a lot in books and I'm kind of sick of it, so I really like the fact that we had a heroine here that was strong and hugely emotional and in touch with her sensitive side. It was just really, really refreshing to read about. So yes, A Wicked Kind of Husband by Mia Vinci definitely earned its place on my favourites list this year. The next book that I have to mention is Kidnapped by the Pirate by Kira Andrews. Again, I've mentioned this book on my channel before in my top 10 MM books, but it definitely had to make it into my top 10 books of the year as well, because it's just one of the most fun, swashbuckling romance stories I've ever had the pleasure of reading. Kira Andrews has said that when she wrote this book, what she was trying to do was write a queer ode to the bodice ripper. She wanted to have your pirates, your virgin, your age gap, your action, your suspense, but she wanted it to be told through the perspective of LGBTQ+ characters, and honestly she pulled it off so incredibly well. This book follows a young nobleman called Nathaniel who, during his journey to meet the fiancée that his father has arranged for him, is kidnapped by pirates at sea and held for ransom by their very intimidating Captain Hawk. This book is so wonderful because it does hark back to those tropes and traditions of older adventure bodice rippers without carrying with it any of those kind of outdated sexist tropes from those earlier iterations. It's just a brilliant book, and Kira Andrews is one of the most underrated romance authors I've come across, so I recommend anything by her, but this one is definitely the one that has the top place on my favourite shelf. The next book I have to recommend is by a very well-known author in the historical romance genre, and that is The Wallflower Wager by Tessa Dare. This is the third book in her Girl Meets Duke series, which for me is by far the best Tessa Dare series. I've read quite a bit of her stuff, but these are the ones that I really keep coming back to when people ask for historical romance recommendations. The series gets better with every instalment, and this one, which is the most recent one, is my favourite for that reason. This book follows the young lady Penelope, who we know from earlier instalments instalments is an animal lover in every sense of the word. Her London home is basically an animal sanctuary. She has a goat, she has chickens, she has several cats and hedgehogs and an otter, I believe. She just has basically a full-blown petting zoo going on in her London address. Whilst her friends are used to and very endeared by this menagerie that Penelope has going on, one person that is not a fan of all the animals is her new neighbour, the self-made man Gabriel Duke. Unwilling to throw her animals out onto the street, Gabriel and Penny make a deal by which he will help find loving homes for all of the animals in exchange for her basically getting rid of them so that he can sell the property next to hers and finally move out. I really loved this book. The central couple of Gabriel and Penny are basically the personification of the sunshine one and the grumpy one trope, and Tessa Dare writes that trope so very well. My favourite thing about this series though is the emphasis on and the portrayal of friendship. The four main heroines of this series have such a wonderfully close and mutually supportive bond, and the relationship and friendship that their respective love interests develop with each other in kind of a parallel male friendship circle is really hilarious and funny and charming as well. Tessa Dare writes group scenes unbelievably well, and they balance out the kind of more intimate romance scenes really incredibly and make this series just super engaging and fun to read. So yeah, I really adored this book, and I wouldn't be surprised if the next and final instalment in the series, The Bride Bet, makes my favourite books of 2021 list. Next up, we finally got another contemporary, and that is Lead by Kylie Scott. Lead is the third book in this Stage Dive series, which revolves around the rock band Stage Dive and their respective love lives. Lead focuses on the band's main singer Jimmy after he gets out of rehab for drug and alcohol addiction. When Jimmy gets out of rehab, he and his bandmates hire a woman called Lena as both his assistant and sobriety companion. However, it's not long before the lines begin to blur when the forced proximity as they're living together leads to their professional working relationship turning into something a lot more personal. I love this book for so many reasons. Firstly, I love a redemption arc, and if you guys have read the earlier installments in this series, you will know that Jimmy is a complete asshole in the first few books and really needs to work on himself in this one to become worthy of Lena. Speaking of Lena, she is just an absolutely kick-ass heroine. She does not take any of Jimmy's shit, but she's also very sympathetic and understanding of him and of his struggles. She really respects what he has been through and the effort he has gone through to rehabilitate himself. Essentially, Kylie Scott just does a wonderful job of taking two very imperfect, very three-dimensional characters and letting them love each other and make each other into better people. And it's just a wonderfully rewarding, romantic, sexy book for that reason, and I would highly recommend the entire series, but especially this one. Next up on this list is another Courtney Milan book. She is the only person to gain 2 spots on this list, which just shows you how much I love her, and this one is The Duchess War, which is the first book in her Brother Sinister series, and coincidentally was also the first book that I read in 2020, so we were definitely off to a strong start this year. It follows a young woman named Minerva who is trying to kind of keep her head down even as she's entering into London society because of something very dark in her past that she's still trying to outrun. However, it becomes very difficult for her to keep a low profile when she catches the attention of Duke Robert Claremont, who is one of the Brothers Sinister, a group of men that met at Eton and developed a friendship because they were all left-handed and they thought it was cool to have a crew. Something I really love and appreciate about Courtney Milan's historical romances is that even when her 2 lead characters are not socially equal, so they might be of different social classes or different genders, so the gender dynamics are kind of complicating things, she still makes them have these really explicit conversations about that, so about their power dynamics, about the socio-political moment in which they're living, and about how they're going to negotiate it so that they can still be equals in their personal relationship. And it's just something that I think that so many more historical romance novels should do. The fact that they are having these conversations in Courtney Milan's books makes me so much more inclined to root for them and ship them, because I don't ever feel like one of them is exploiting the other in any way. I always know when I'm entering a Courtney Milan book that even if they are socially occupying completely different echelons, when it comes down to those 2 main characters, they are each other's moral, intellectual, internal equals in every way, and I just love that, and it was something that I felt really strongly in this first book with Min and Robert. I also love, and I don't think it's a spoiler to say this, we get a virgin hero in this book. I feel like every hero in romance is just like a rake that knows every move going, but Robert doesn't, and he's very honest about that, and it makes for some of the most rewarding sex scenes in romance novels that I've read, because it pushes the importance of communication so much more, and it's just like really excellent, revolutionary to read. The next book that made it onto my favourites list is Heated Rivalry by Rachel Reed. This book follows Ilya Rozanov and Shane Hollander, who are two very famous ice hockey rivals who, unbeknownst to the entirety of the world, have been carrying on a sexual relationship behind closed doors for several years. However, this long-term arrangement becomes more complicated when the two of them realise that what started out as a purely physical connection is becoming deeper and more romantic as time passes. I adored this book. I know I said that I wasn't ranking within the top 10, but if I was, Heated Rivalry would definitely make the top 3. That's how much I absolutely loved it. It was just a standout read for me this year. I remember I read a lot of this book when me and my friend were queuing for tickets to a concert, and I must have annoyed her so much that day because the entire time in the queue I was just kind of like half talking to her and half like frantically reading to get to the end of this book because I was so desperate to find out what happened to Ilya and Shane. It is just both a lovely romance and a really moving insight into the lives of LGBTQ+ sports people that perhaps feel forced into the closet by the very macho environment in which they're working. It was heartbreaking and romantic and hilarious, and I am so excited to tell all you guys, if you didn't know already, that Rachel Reed has announced that she is coming out with a sequel to their book in 2022, I believe. So we're going to be getting more Ilya and Shane within the next few years, which I'm just delighted about. But yeah, everyone should read Heated Rivalry if you haven't already. It is just one of my absolute standout books of the year. And the final book I have to mention is Bear, Otter and the Kid by TJ Klune. So the entire series revolves around siblings Derek and Tyson McKenna, who go by Bear and the Kid respectively, as they try to survive on their own after their mother abandons them. This book focuses pretty much exclusively on Bear, as in his early 20s he's kind of adjusted to that single parent / big brother role, only to have his personal life be uprooted in yet another way when he begins to unexpectedly develop feelings for his best friend's older brother, Otter, when he returns to their small Oregon town. This book is absolutely hilarious. As you guys will know, because I don't shut up about it on this channel, TJ Klune is like a master of balancing real like laugh out loud humour with moments of really deep and profound emotion, and Bear, Otter and the Kid is probably the series that is most representative of that. It's a book that deals with these really profound themes like brotherhood and first love and second chances and found family, all whilst telling the story through this snarky, hilarious 100 miles per hour internal monologue that Bear has. If you want to be laughing 1 second and then crying uncontrollably the next, Bear, Otter and the Kid is definitely the book for you. And again, this first book is in Kindle Unlimited, so if you guys have that subscription, it is 100% worth checking it out. Okay, I feel like I've been here for about 7 hours, and you guys probably feel the same, so you'll be glad to know that that is the end of the list. Those are all of my favourite books of 2020. I hope that you guys have had wonderful reading years as well. As always, if you have any recommendations for me, please do leave a comment below. I'm always looking for new books, and I need to get started on my 2021 reading list if I want to beat my own little goal that I set this year. Other than that, I hope you guys have a safe and happy new year, and I hope that 2021 brings us all better things and more happily ever afters. So until my next video, thank you so much for watching for all of this year, and goodbye!